My name's Tasman Crowe, and I'm the director of the UCD Earth Institute. And so on behalf of the Institute, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this event. It's been organised as part of the Plotting the Future series, which we've been running jointly with the Geary Institute of Public Policy, the Humanities Institute and the Discovery Institute. And I can see the directors of those are joining us as well, which is great. But a particular welcome to Danny Dorling, who has kindly agreed to join us remotely under the circumstances. I was really looking forward to meeting you in person, but this will have to do for now. I would also like to thank very much our panel members and the chair, Professor Jacky Croke. And I'll hand over to Jacky now to do the introductions in a bit more detail and to carry things forward. So thanks very much indeed, Jacky.
Cheers, thanks, Taz. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce a fellow geographer here. Danny Dorling is an award-winning academic, highly acclaimed author, and sought-after social commentator based at Oxford University in the UK, where he holds the post of the Halford McKinnard Professor of Geography. Described by the Guardian newspaper as that rare university professor, expert, politically engaged, and describes easily why his subject matters. Danny's ability to build extraordinary pictures out of ordinary clouds of data is equally as impressive and educational. A prolific writer and sought after public speaker, Danny has published 18 books, focusing mainly on issues of social inequality in the UK, but he's also called extensively for his expertise as a social geographer by the UK media and government institutions. Danny is joining us today to talk about his new book, Slowdown, the End of the Great Acceleration, and why it's good for the planet, the economy, and our lives. In particular, Danny is going to focus on the geopolitical issues that emerged out of his new book. Danny will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we're also going to hear some questions from our expert panel. So it's also a great pleasure to welcome this afternoon to Dr. Larry O'Connell, Director of the National Economic and Social Council, who advises the Taoiseach on strategic policy issues relating to sustainable economic, social and environmental development in Ireland. Welcome too to Dr. Moran, Director of the UCD Quality Studies Centre and also Associate Professor at the UCD School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice. Welcome too to Dr. Bradley Garrett, my colleague, a newly appointed Assistant Professor at the UCD School of Geography, Social and Cultural Geography. Bradley's research intersects the urban and subterranean geographies. So following the discussion from the panelists, there will be an opportunity to take questions from the audience using the chat function on Zoom. So please feel free to send those through at any point. Also, just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute for the duration of the event. And also just to note that the talk and questions will be recorded and may be used subsequently on the UCD website. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to invite Danny to take the stage for his presentation. And I'm sure we're all super excited to hear about his new book. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you for the invite. And I'm obviously very sorry I can't physically be over there, but it's great to be able to talk about this work and to hear what people have to say. The book has only just been published in Britain and it's published in about a week's time in the USA. The book's taken me about 6 years to write. I was lucky I kind of had 6 years to do it. And it's a book about trends over time. And part of the reason I was interested in looking at trends over time was because, well, I was finding it harder to draw maps. As you get older, you get less technically able. And time is just one-dimensional. So I thought, let's just look at what's happening over time. And I thought I would be writing a book about those things which were speeding up and those things which were slowing down. So the book wasn't supposed to be the book that you get, because what I found was that almost everything that I measured was actually slowing down, not necessarily going down, but slowing down. And from finding something that I hadn't expected to see, I then came up with ideas, which are ideas that I hadn't had before. And of course, from reading lots of other people's ideas, that's mainly how we get ideas. I'm going to try and share my screen now. So with luck, in a couple of seconds, you ought to begin to see a screen happening now. Thank you. Oh, sandcastles. I like making sandcastles and doing things slowly. Why is it called The End of the Great Acceleration, and why it's good for the planet, the economy, and our lives? Why is that the subtitle of this book? That's because people tend to interpret Slowdown as bad. So you kind of have to say, no, you're not talking about something that is bad when you're talking about the slowing down.
Sorry, Danny, to interrupt. We're seeing your speaker view rather than the projected main slide.
Oh, is that? Okay.
I think you can click swap displays and that might do it.
Yes, I can. How about that now?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Oh, are you seeing a little dot moving, by the way?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, that's great. I've got click forward. We're talking about chapter 10 of the book today. It's a book of 12 chapters. Chapter 10 is geopolitics. And when you write a book with 12 chapters, chapter 10 is where you stick the things that you know have to go into the book, but you're not too confident to actually give them a chapter of their own. And this book is all about empirical data. So the chapter contains, I think it's 9 figures. They don't actually animate in the book, but you're seeing one here. And I should explain what it is. It's the average height of human beings in the world, as far as they can be measured. I'm somebody who's obsessed by data. So this begins in 1896. People born in 1896, and the height they reached when they're adults, which on average, men and women combined, was about 157 centimeters at that point. Now, the reason that dot is going up vertically at the moment is because at these times, the average height of human beings in the world was rising every year, and actually rising pretty steadily. It only began to stop rising around about 1940, 1950. And you can see that it actually reached the maximum for people born around 1978, and it's shrunk a little bit since. And you might be thinking, why does this matter to politics? What has the height of human beings got to do with politics? And it has everything to do when you look at people who study height. Height reached a minima for human beings at the time of mass incarceration in effect in factories, particularly in places like Manchester and Liverpool. Our height had already fallen when we began to farm, but it got lower. And then the standards of living rose as people fought and got their rights, as they could get themselves out of child labour and so on. It increases and increases, but there's a limit. There's a limit to how high human beings can get. We essentially go back to the height that people were from the skeletons of hunter-gatherers. The reason it falls, by the way, don't worry, we're not getting shorter. It's actually the mix of human beings on the planet. People in countries which tend to have smaller human beings are still increasing in number more than countries that are taller. I'll click forward now, because that's about enough about height, I suspect. Graduates. I'm thinking about graduates, number of students in the world. This is UNESCO data. And this is one of those rare things that isn't slowing down or wasn't slowing down. So the reason that the graph tilts to the right is that it's not just that the proportion of young people who are graduates in the world was rising most years from the 1970 onwards. It's that the rise in most years was bigger than the rise before, particularly here in the 90s. You see it zooming through. increases of 1% a year, 2% a year in the proportion of young people going to universities worldwide. An incredible increase, you know, with times of slowdown, but also generally an acceleration. Why does this matter for politics and geopolitics? It matters because one thing about going to a university is it tells you that you're not stupid, almost irrespective of what we actually do in universities. Going to university, you know, parts of makes you literate and everything else. It tells you that you can't be talked down to. So when you have this proportion of people in the world going to universities, it changes what's possible. I'm going to click forward again. There are complicated graphs in the book. I don't sort of shy too much from showing those which are a bit messy, and I stick all the ones that I relate to politics in here. This is data for England and Wales and a number of people, how many hundreds of thousands are getting married each year. And you just see a little ball, if you're following a little ball, we're rather like cats. If you put a little red ball and move it, human beings sort of tend to follow the ball. You'll see that suddenly from going from 350,000 marriages a year in the 80s, the number of people getting married each year from about 1989 onwards begins to plummet. So 350 down to 320, down to 300, down to 250,000 in just a decade. Now, what was going on in that decade in the 90s? And here that graph is showing that it is possible to get a sudden change. And I personally interpreted that sudden change from we went from a world in which, certainly for England and Wales, you were supposed to get married, you really had to get married, to a world in which you could choose whether you wanted to get married or not. Of course, this year, that's going to plumb well under 200,000 because not many people want to get married if they can't have a party, and they can't have a party anyway. There are complicated, even more complicated graphs. I've drawn lots and lots of graphs of voting, opinions, and so on. I just put two in the book. This is voting in New York State as compared to the rest of the United States, showing how it kind of veers towards Democrats at particular times, particularly towards Obama. And then I won't say much about Trump because that's not particularly exciting. I'm going to go forward. And this, if you like, some of the really weak stuff in the book. There isn't something really clear or obvious from this, although I talk about it. But it's interesting. One thing I do suggest is that you can see New York State moving away from the rest of America. And the question is whether thinking in New York State was ahead or not. Let's go to London and the UK. So here is the vote share over a very long period of time in London, which used to be quite a conservative city in terms of how it voted. And the reason I put this in really is just very recent politics in the UK. You can see a sudden shift at the end from 2015 to 2017. Something not normal happened. And one useful thing of drawing these graphs is it's one way of saying when your times are unusual, when they're not. The thing that happened that was unusual in 2017 was that London in particular moved away from the Conservatives and to Labour very, very quickly. And there's a question about whether London was a place ahead of its time or not. Not many more of these to go. This is global now, getting away from being parochial and rolling out small countries. This is the change in GDP per capita per year. And the point of this is to show you that our highest growth rate in GDP was actually way back in 1950, or possibly in 1964. But if you squint and look at that graph in front of you, you can see it's leaning towards the left. Every decade has had slower growth than the decade before worldwide. We are slowing down. We don't tend to look at that. We tend to look at individual effects, like here, the recession of the early 1980s, or the small recession of the early 1990s, or the growth of 2006, then the crash of 2008, and so on. And of course, right now, we're going to be obsessed about a worldwide recession to do with a pandemic. But if you can take yourself away from those particular instances that transfix us, there is so much evidence of a slowing down occurring. And if it's true, a slowing down has implications. Some things have to slow down, and of course, politically, one of the most important things, or the most important thing, is the environmental crisis. I equate it to being as important as the risk of nuclear Armageddon in the 1970s and 1980s. And this graph is just here. It looks like good news. It's showing you that the rate of species extinction has slowed since the 1980s, when we really were managing to kill off the majority of very rare animals in very small islands. But the reason that this particular graph leans to the left is that if it hadn't, if the rate of species extinction hadn't slowed down as it has, tragically it would have hit 100%. And all species would be extinct, including us. So just saying, the graphs can be a bit deceptive, but that shows how bad it is. And that actually is the least worst of the scenarios produced by the Zoological Society. Not many more to go now. And it is all over the place. But the book is less all over the place than you might think, because there are only so many data sets that are of good enough quality that you can actually look at the rate of change and the rate of change of change. As I said, I've shown you graduates already. There are only 4 things actually speeding up. One was graduates. This is the number of flights being taken worldwide. These flights, by the way, are almost all being taken by a very tiny number of people. If you fly, you're unusual in the world. You don't think you're unusual because you think everybody flies, but flying is an incredibly unusual thing. In the UK, the majority of people who fly on the cheapest airlines are social class A, B, C, 1. Most people born in the world now, most children in the world will never fly, even if we hadn't had a reduction in flying as what we're about to get. So flying was one of the rare ones. Accelerating, I showed you graduates. The other 2 are overall carbon emissions and temperature. Everything else is falling or rising, but slowing. And this is my last slide. One of the things driving this is the reduction in the number of us. The number of babies you can see slowing dramatically there in the 70s. Appears to have another rise in the 80s, but that's just the babies that are being born to the baby boom before. And then you see about 120 million, 125 million being added. And as you come around to now, you can suddenly see a stalling, and then the number of babies goes down. We are predicted very, very strongly by many bodies now, not just the UN, that within the lifetime of babies being born now, the population of the planet will actually fall towards the end of their lifetime. Human growth, the number of humans, the size of the market, no longer growing, has a fundamental effect on what is possible, including what kind of profit you can expect to make. I'm going to stop sharing that now. Hopefully you can see me again. And just conclude. This is empirical. It's a book driven by a surprise of finding that things that people thought were accelerating, the amount of data in the world, the amount of student debt in America, were not actually accelerating, and finding this consistent signal of a slowing down, particularly in the richest countries of the world, but also overall. And if you take fertility in the last few years, the number of babies that people have fallen the most in the poorest countries where people have the highest number of babies. So things that we thought were tentatively possible, say 10 or 20 years ago, now look much more sure. That changes, or I think that changes what people will believe is possible, because you cannot promise people that their children will be richer than them, because there'll be more people to exploit, and so your market gets bigger and your profits get bigger, when you have a planet where the number of consumers not only is not going to increase, but they're also going to get older, wiser, and better educated. So it's a question of how many people do you really think you can fool when you no longer have so many naive young people to fool. Thank you very much. I will stop at that point because I think I've had my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Danny. That was a fascinating talk. We don't often get to see the data presented that way, actually, so it was really interesting following those dots there. I'm going to hand over now to our expert panel, Dr. Larry O'Connell. So each panel member has a few questions lined up for Danny. So Larry, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much, Danny. I certainly enjoyed reading the book and enjoyed the presentation. I have 3 questions for you, Danny. The first question, I just want to tease out with you what I fear might be a little bit of over-optimism in your book. The second one is maybe what I fear is some over-pessimism, and then maybe just a question to tease out some lessons for COVID. On page 263 in chapter 10, I think you state that we're heading towards a more just and stable future. And I certainly hope that's the case. But in our work in NESC, we've been looking at this question of transition, and our experience is that it's extremely difficult, messy, and costly to bring about the type of transition that will be needed. So I suppose what I would feel is there a danger that your work may inadvertently make it seem like the transition to a future where there's, as you say, slower growth, that it will be, that in a sense that transition may not be as difficult to do as we think. And I mean, for example, you talk about inequality, the rates falling in certain parts of the world. I mean, that's true, but still inequality is extremely high, even in Ireland, and we have to work very hard within our social welfare system to redress inequality. So that's my first question. Is there a sense that might be a little bit over-optimistic? The second one is, I think you outline what I would see as quite a pessimistic view about technological progress. I mean, you make this following statement. You say technological progress is so slow that even a minor adaptation to a vacuum cleaner is heralded as a great advance. I would have to say I thought that was brilliantly put, but I just feel, is it not the case that in every generation we're tempted to feel that we live at a time where so much has changed that there won't be another big breakthrough? And I suppose my feeling would be that we live at a time where we face probably the biggest humanity crisis we've ever faced in terms of climate and biodiversity loss, and now combined with the COVID-19. My sense would be that if there isn't major technological breakthroughs that are going to come to our assistance, then would we not almost now just give up? And I was interested, in a sense, in Bradley's book about bunkers, and I felt, well, maybe people have given up. So I just want to canvass that idea with you, that you might be a bit pessimistic about technology. And my last question is, you referred to, in chapter 10, to the idea that we really need to learn from countries in the slowdown, and you wrote that before the current crisis. And I think that that's really intriguing. It has become, certainly in my job over the last 2 months, has become the absolutely critical focus for us, is to try to learn from people who are slightly ahead of us on the curve. And some of that's obviously about, things such as designing a better payment scheme for workers, for families, better tracing technologies, etc. But we're also trying to look to see where in the world are people using this crisis to really fundamentally rethink how they live. And for example, we came across the work that's happening in Melbourne City around redesigning the way they use space, and I believe the same is happening in New York. So I suppose I just wondered whether in your work, where you look to other countries to learn lessons, have you now got a sense of maybe where the 1 or 2 or 3 big lessons that you might take from this crisis in terms of how they might help us to rethink a world in which there is a slowdown? So thank you, Danny.
Thank you ever so much. Brilliant questions. The first one on complacency. Yes, in a sense, although I was trying to write this book for people who may not be worried, because if you write a book about it's all terrible, we have to change everything now, only people who believe it's all terrible, we have to change everything now, might read it. I was also worried that a lot of students that I teach think it's all over. It's game over. We've got 12 years and we're not going to make it.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to give hope. I do say, but I don't make enough of it in the book, carbon emissions were doubling every 24 years. And then we managed to reduce it, so they doubled every 23. The most pathetic reduction in the second derivative of change ever. And that's your thing that needs to completely crash. And perhaps I should have been more clear, rather than just sticking that in one tiny page, not in chapter 10. You can't change the doubling rate ever so slightly and think there's any hope, given the linear relationship between carbon and temperature. I suppose the reason for the complacency is that I did grow up at a time when I believed we were all going to die in a nuclear war. And a graph I don't put in the book is nuclear warheads and how they fell 90% when the hawks finally realized we're going to be annihilated, but also generational change. A lot of us form our ideas, I think I did, largely between the age of, say, 14 and 20. Most of what I believe about the world and people now, I think I largely believed then. And people now between 14 and 20 do believe if you behave like this, it'll all end. The question is, do we have long enough to wait for them to grow up or to hope for the 30-year-olds or not? That's my worry about complacency. My sort of excuse is I'm trying to pull people in who have ignored this because they don't want to think about it, to begin to think about the slowing down. And then if you are slowing down, if you're not going to be able to get your way out of it, I don't know, by heading off to Mars, you know, the people who talk about going to other planets, it's just silly. You can't do that at all. We can't get there. On the tech, I just think we can do a lot of it with what we've got. Extra tech would help massively. So you probably know they're growing protein in Helsinki without sunlight, which is incredible. You can grow the protein for the world in a tiny amount of space, and you don't need to kill animals and have such huge numbers of animals. So if the extra tech like that does come along, great. But we could already just eat far fewer animals, you know, rather than necessarily grow it in Helsinki. So it's not a reliance on extra tech having to appear. And also skepticism of being a 50-year-old man who was a tech nerd as a teenager. So, you know, when I was doing my PhD in the 80s, we were into the second artificial intelligence revolution, when we were being told artificial intelligence would change everything, as I am skeptical. Your last question, places to look. There's been a comparison in the last week between the response to COVID in Norway and the UK, and just how people are not thrown into destitution in Norway when they can't work. And, you know, of course, we've been saying this for years, but there's no better kind of lesson than when several million people are looking at destitution to say, okay, look at Norway and work out why you do not have that. Or look at Japan for 2 lost decades, or my favorite, which is always Finland, as a place without extra resources and so on, which is doing so well. And also, another lesson about the pandemic, the Finns have been planning for this since 1957 and restocking their stock of PPE since 1957. It's a different attitude to the get rich quick, we'll be okay, and the horrible attitude that you did see at the start of this crisis. I've kept the quotes from business articles saying how terrible it was that the Prime Minister spoke while the markets were open because they lost a little bit of money. Or even, we can afford to lose 10% of the planet's population but still do okay economically. You know, after this crisis has finished, I think we need to look at some of the things that were said at the beginning of it and what it reveals about how brutal some people actually were and still are. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Danny. Thanks, Larry. Marie Moran, you've got some questions ready for Danny as well.
Sure. Thanks, Jacky, and thanks very much, Danny. I really enjoyed your talk and also the book on which it's based. So I'll just dive in with what I think is really valuable about your book, and then a question, as I said previously, about the place of the political. So I found your argument that we should first recognise and then embrace this slowdown very engaging, refreshing and hopeful. As you described so well, it has until now been extremely difficult to even imagine a slowdown because we're so used to descriptions of our world as always speeding up, always producing more in newer and faster ways. And even modernity, I think, was understood in these terms. To paraphrase Habermas, modernity is the collective consciousness of the extreme novelty of the times in which we live. And so it's really hard to see outside this way of thinking, or even to realize that this is a way of thinking. So one of the things I enjoyed very much about your book was what I felt was your incisive challenge to this way of thinking and your capacity to frame a slowdown in much more favorable terms than people might naturally arrive at themselves, given the relentless positivity with which constant acceleration and novelty has been pushed. And then, of course, you published this book right at a point in time where people are experiencing very rapidly and without much warning an enormous slowdown thanks to COVID-19. And your narrative is there to tell people, okay, this isn't a disaster. It was happening anyway, and there are some positives here. But this brings me to my query. As I was reading, I started to feel that the book was curiously passive in tone. It seems to me that much of the hope of the book derives from a particular kind of claim, which is that once X slows down as it is doing, Y will improve. So to take some examples, you claim that, and this is not just in chapter 10, but across the book, once economic growth and population growth continues to slow, there will be lower inflation, less waste, more durable goods, better housing, better education, less onerous work, fewer social problems and fewer environmental problems. But this way of formulating these causal claims seems to me to erase human activity, both in the slowdown itself and in how its effects are translated into different kinds of outcomes. So while at times you refer to human aspiration, suggesting there needs to be a widespread collective willingness to achieve the positive changes attendant on slowdown, and elsewhere that what transpires in the future depends on what we choose to do now, this to me doesn't seem to resolve a tension in the book, which is between arguing on the one hand that slowdown and its benefits are inevitable, happening anyway, irrespective of human aspiration and choices, and then arguing on the other that human aspiration and choices will be absolutely central to the creation of this new, more sustainable, more equal, slowed down world. So for me, there's an uncertainty about the role of human agency, both in creating or accelerating slowdown, and then in pushing this slowdown in either a progressive or more equal, or a regressive or less equal direction. And these observations give rise to a key question for me, which is where is the political in your work? Or more specifically, what is the role of practical politics in the great deceleration and in the translation of its effects into positive outcomes that enhance rather than undermine human flourishing and social equality? So while your work has a very valuable, for me, optimistic and even prophetic air, I'm just not clear how many of the predicted changes will actually come about in the absence of mass mobilization and political action, and not just aspiration and choice. And this pressure from below, I think, needs to be directed against groups routinely referred to as the elites of capitalist societies. So that's the very powerful and wealthy who benefit enormously from the current functioning of political economy, and who, as far as I can see, have little or no will to change this, and even the power to block changes. And on the other hand, I think pressure needs to be mobilized against the structural forces of capitalism, as these are built into our institutions, our corporations, social arrangements, organizations and practices. And I can't see any kind of significant egalitarian change in relation to slowdown happening without both sets of struggle. And then there's the ancillary point that if you tell people this is going to happen anyway, with or without their efforts, will this remove the political urgency that many feel is so necessary to push through crucial changes at the moment? Now, of course, now is a unique time and a unique opportunity, as people have real experience, as I said, of slowdown under COVID-19, I think both of new possibilities for a better world, but also new dangers, new inequalities, and new oppressions. I think as many people have noted, it's truly the best of times and the worst of times. And there's a clear sense that things could go either way after the crisis passes. But this is also to frame things passively, as though how it goes is independent of political action. So I think somebody has shared a screen. I'm viewing Richard's screen. Is that happening? Anyway, I'm sorry. As many, so on the left, I think we've been very scarred after the last crisis. Given how obvious it was that capitalism had failed us all so miserably, I think we expected a brave new anti-capitalist world. But what we got instead was a doubling down on capitalist values and initiatives and ambitions and practices. So while I think the message of your book is very, very hopeful, this is how it could be, I think now more than ever, it needs to be accompanied by a strong political message that this will not happen automatically and that now is the time to act.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do accept a lot of that criticism, particularly at the start of your question. It's tricky working out what to put into a book which began about a series of trends and trends which surprised me. I do quite a lot of passive X does this and then Y follows. Yeah. But partly because I'm aware that there will be other things that happen. There will always other things that happen that we don't predict. So it's partly saying we can try to guess that this will happen. One example would be that when I was at school, to get my geography A-level grade, I had to write about how the world was cooling down. This was 1986, and we thought we were entering an ice age. No sign of global warming at all. So a lot of things that will happen in the future will be things that we currently do not consider an issue. Human agency, I don't make enough of it, but half of the book is about fertility and how many children people have. And that is largely, almost entirely, about a private discussion between mainly men and women, where men are increasingly not getting what they want, which globally is half an extra child, which sounds odd, but that is what it is. And in particular, women getting what they want increasingly in the poorest places. And that I should have made more of is a mass politics of power changing. And if you want any kind of message about what happened over the last 100 years, it's the changing position of women, which was political. And I should have said more about it, an agency. It's not just the agency of people who want a better world winning that matters, although clearly you can see around the world those countries where we failed. In the rich world, this is the UK, the USA, Brazil, Russia, Turkey. They're clustered on top of the COVID graph at the moment, in a kind of like screaming out at people, saying, "Look, this is what happens if you elect a narcissistic old man to be in charge of your country." But of course, the agency does also matter partly on hopefully the inability of people who don't want this. So, for instance, I don't know, I was just saying, in the UK, if we currently had David Cameron being all slick and caring, he could do much better than actually having a pretty unable Prime Minister advised by somebody who still wants to tear apart the state entirely, and that's in our current documents. So it's not just the future, isn't given. It depends on agency and people fighting, but it also depends a little bit on luck and the opponents hopefully being less able than we think. But I also think people need to know it's possible. Because there comes a time after the first time people write about, say, socialism, and they write about their ideas for the millennium and what a wonderful world it'll be. Decades and decades later, it is harder and harder to believe in that. And so trying to show, look, those people who say we can exploit more and make your grandchildren rich just believe in us and carry on taking it now. I think that won't work. But there certainly could be more of a call for arms in the book. There's a little bit of Greta, because you have to remember it took me 6 years to write this book. So it was written for before Greta was doing anything. And I remember writing in a draft of the book, there's this girl sitting in a square in Sweden on her own. I just remember doing that. And by the time I finally finished the book, of course, there was nothing special about that story. Everybody in the world knew a story which was special and unique at the time at the beginning. But I am an optimistic, ridiculously hopeful person. Last thing to say on the optimism, and it goes back to COVID. In the book, I have a section on the 1918 pandemic, where I say, because we were in a period of acceleration, it was as if it never happened.
Yeah.
Global GDP dropped by 14% one year, and then rose by 16% the next. And it wasn't just the 1918 pandemic that kind of hardly shows up. It was the 1951, 1957, and I was in the 1968 pandemic, only just. More people died in 1968 worldwide, more people died in Britain. Does anybody remember the 1968 pandemic? No. And the question is, why not? And it's partly because we were accelerating forward. We were going places, the economy was growing. Huge numbers of people could actually die. And we were more brutal then, and we didn't care, and we didn't have cures. But the great difference now, the reaction to this is so different. And part of the reason it may be different is we value human life higher. You try and say, get back to work now. And part of the reason you can't is agency. People are not willing to be told by political leaders, trust us, go to school. And I don't know, it gives me a bit of optimism, although we do need at some point to work out when the death rates fall from this. We don't all have to stay stuck in our houses forever. But thank you ever so much for that.
Thank you. That's a good segue into our next panelist, Bradley Garrett, and his maybe slightly alternative pessimistic view with the bunkers. So Bradley, you have a few questions. Maybe just for the sake of Danny, just break them up a bit, and so he can get a chance to answer them consecutively.
Okay. Yeah, how did you know I was going to be the pessimist on the panel here? Danny, I really enjoyed the book, as always. Seeing the graphs moving, I don't know how you make these things, but they're fantastic. And I wish, I hope in the digital version of the book we can see those graphs moving as we do on the screen here. I know that you advised against focusing too much on one event and thinking about this slowdown. But of course, we've got a very short memory when it comes to disasters, right? All we're thinking about is COVID, and yet, as you say, this climate crisis is still unraveling in the background. We just came out of terrible bushfires in Australia. We've had hurricanes, we've had flooding, and I couldn't help, as I was reading your book, but think about Paul Virilio's, the philosopher Paul Virilio's statement about how we've constructed our societies and how we've constructed a situation where there's a possibility for a disaster to happen everywhere at the same time. And it certainly feels like we're in that disaster now, and that we have been in that disaster for some time. So I see the slowdown happening. I agree with your argument, but I'm also kind of frustrated that it takes hitting biological, environmental, infrastructural, and economic limits, right? It takes some kind of cosmic surprise or to hit a wall before we slow down. I don't see a lot of human agency in that slowdown, and I would like to have more hope in that. And your book did give me a little bit of that, but you critique globalization, free markets, neoliberal ideologies in the book, but you don't quite go far enough into saying, I think, that maybe one answer to this is deurbanization. Maybe we've hit the limits of urbanization. There was during the Cold War, there was a nuclear strategist called Herman Kahn, and he developed this notion called prime target fixation syndrome, when people who lived in big cities and knew that they were potentially going to be the target of a nuclear attack fled to the suburbs. And that's when we saw a lot of that move into suburban space. I wonder if these accelerating disasters that are sort of laying bare the fragility of the infrastructure that's keeping cities going is going to cause a similar move. And so I guess this is my first question. Is deurbanization part of this slowdown? And do you think it's potentially beneficial if people start leaving cities?
Okay, on the first one, I should say you talked about the graphs at the beginning. They're actually drawn, the animations, by my friend Kirsty McClure, and so not me. But the only reason she drew them is that her normal job is a busker on the underground, and ever since they introduced contactless, of course, it's much harder to make money as a busker. But good news for me in the animations. But I shouldn't claim credit for them. Urbanisation is certainly part of it. Urbanisation was necessary. Without 50, now 60% of the world urbanising, and it's going to carry on rising, it wouldn't have been possible to get up to these kind of numbers of human beings that easily. There are lots of stories at the moment about house prices rising in remote rural areas as people try and work out how the hell do I get out of London. I think it's too early for that. Also, you could try and do a second thing to your list of disasters. You could talk about what are the disasters which are not happening now, which were happening 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So huge numbers of civil wars across Africa and elsewhere, often with the Americans causing them, or famine. There are a series of things which have not got worse. Life expectancy of the population of the planet has never been higher. It's incredible. It's in its early 70s. Infant mortality, the latest low was only 93 babies dying in Finland in 2015, the lowest ever. So these are what I don't accept ever, is when people tell me that we have the lowest poverty ever, which is really, really annoying. But can you try and tell that to somebody on $2 a day, or on $10 a day, or on 20, or on universal credit, but not having to see your children die, that is an incredible change that's occurred. So the urbanisation is needed. Part of what I think you're doing, so I'll wrap it now, what you're doing is what is absolutely necessary for humans to survive, which is the looking out for the thing that's going to get us. I remember I once came up with a list of 44 ways in which the world was thought that was going to end, of which the most silly maybe was killer bees, but there really were people who believed in killer bees, and the most serious were the soil being washed away. We are a really nervous species. We are really good at looking sideways, looking for what's going to get us. And that's partly, I think, what helps human beings spread. We're also a very young species, and that's not good news because most species that are very young don't get to live for much longer. But it is that fear and worry. We became complacent over pandemics. That's obvious. And as how much longer will we carry on being, we're going to worry for the next 10, 20 years. But you and I, certainly you because you're younger than me, may get to a point where you notice that people have stopped worrying about it. And it's this attention thing. Human beings are not good at stepping back, remembering the things to worry about that haven't happened for several decades, looking at long-term change, and we're not patient. We say we have to sort it now in the next 2 years, but we never do that. We change our world generation by generation. There's generations that change their beliefs and are willing to allow something different to happen. We're pretty stubborn within a generation. Anyway, did you have another question? Sorry.
Well, yeah. So I have two more, but in the interest of time, I know we're pushing it, so I'll wrap it into one for you here, and it's connected in any case. As Larry mentioned, thanks for the plug, Larry. But I've been working with doomsday preppers, people who are leaving cities, building bunkers, and they're kind of upskilling in a lot of those skills that we've lost. So you write in the book that we're less able to do many of the practical tasks that our great grandparents were very good at. And that's something I wholeheartedly agree with you on. And I wonder if, so first I wonder if gaining some of those skills back, growing, canning, hunting, foraging, whatever skills people have lost, partially partially due to urbanization, if that gives people a sense of agency, and if maybe that would help with this slowing down. And I also wonder, a lot of these bunker builders are telling me that they couldn't do what they're doing without technology, right? Without solar panel. I mean, all of the off-grid infrastructure that they're using to escape into the wilderness didn't exist, 15 years ago. So, what role is technology going to play in this deacceleration?
Okay, just quickly on that. I mean, there isn't enough space for many people to do what they're doing, so they can do it, but clearly it's a success. One of my brothers once lived on the land in France with the Donga tribe, and where they dug their own pit latrines, and the amount of space that was required for that is low. So this is, it's an option for a few people and some very, very rich people. But the increase in technology, so the increase in doing things yourself, I think is interesting. Not just because I have an enormous number of potatoes currently planted out the side of my house, because I'm not completely an optimist. There is a chance that we may actually need the potatoes, but it's quite nice to do it. But also, one way in which we can measure this is this. I'll end on this. A thing called the Flynn effect, and the Flynn effect is the increase in IQ every generation. Every generation gets better when we test their IQ. They're better at doing logic and so on. Now, it isn't actually that they're getting cleverer. It's that instead of learning how to skin a rabbit, you're learning what a log graph is. So one way to look at the Flynn effect and this increase in ability generation after generation is to think, what on earth have we lost that means that our children are increasingly nerdy? And is that concentration of nerdiness that we call education actually that beneficial to us or our happiness? Do you really need to force young people to learn things that aren't necessarily needed by so many young people to increase the way that we measure their IQ? And that would then lead to greater happiness and to being a bit calmer about things. And this is an interesting time to slow down and thinking, where were we accelerating to? What was the point of getting that degree, which was going to allow you to get that further master's degree, that was going to get you that job, which was going to pay you 3 times more than other people in your generation? None of which currently exists and is not going to recruit for 1 or 2 years, and probably wouldn't have made you that happy anyway. So I'm hoping that out of the current crisis, it makes it easier to explain things that we had to change anyway.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Bradley. Thanks, Danny. I get the feeling that our discussion is a bit like an onion here, lots of layers and depth to it. Thankfully, nobody has cried yet. But anyway, our audience have sent in a couple of questions, actually. So if it's okay with you, Danny, I'll read out maybe a couple of those. Anne Fuchs asks, the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa published 3 influential books on acceleration. Basically, he claims that late modernity is in the grip of unstoppable acceleration, one-sided theory of modernity. Anyway, do you have any views on that, and how do you might respond to that theory and conceptualize that agency?
I haven't, and so it's a good question. I haven't read those books. I have read other books by sociologists about acceleration. and I'm trying as I get older not to be mean, but I do quote in the book, and they're quite funny because they tend to talk about acceleration without any evidence, and then they feel they need some evidence. And one of them, the evidence that they had, the first bit of evidence in this book about acceleration, was that the speed at which people were speaking in the Norwegian parliament had increased over decades. Now, if that is your first fact to try to claim that there's an acceleration going on, that Norwegians are speaking slightly faster than they used to be, you can tell you're on shaky waters. So we were accelerating incredibly fast. We were accelerating in terms of population by 2% a year by 1968, the fastest acceleration ever. Our acceleration in technology was incredible. There's just a lag between the time when the acceleration was really fast and what we think is going on in the world. There's a famous quote from Trudeau that you think things are going fast and they're going faster now than ever before, but now is really slow compared to the future that will be faster yet. And it sounds great until you try to measure anything. And that's my basic point, is that as soon as you measure it, you don't find this acceleration that people feel is happening. Why do they feel it's happening? Two reasons. One is it was happening for their parents and grandparents. And secondly, as you get older, you get a sort of sense that you're being disconnected. And you think, oh, that must be the acceleration. I think that happens to us as well.
Yeah, great answer. Thanks, Danny. Question here from Neve about urbanisation, which has been predicted, on accelerated economic development since the Industrial Revolution. How do you reimagine the shape of future cities in the context of a great slowdown, Danny?
Yes, in a kind of very sort of simplistic way, and I go on in the book, particularly at the end, about Tokyo. I just think Tokyo is undervalued, ignored. This third great megacity in the world after New York and London. Particularly now, we mustn't keep on coming back to it, but the different experience of Tokyo to New York and London is just shocking, given how near Tokyo is to China. But Tokyo is a city with almost no cars, public transport, very low violence, very low crime, not perfect, but also a city not changing, a city that's very dense. All the trends show that we are going to carry on getting denser. Environmentally, it makes a lot of sense to pack human beings together, and we quite normally like being around each other, normally. My suspicion is that carries on, but as the amount of wilderness also increases, people will, and I say it in the book, and the book was finished in early January, people will travel less far distance and will much more often go to wilderness, which is near to where the city is in which they live. At the moment, you were kind of pulled away by tourism companies to tell you you're only going to be happy if you get on a plane and fly to a beach. But when we measure the rate of happiness on holidays, we don't find that holidays make people happier. It was just something that you could sell. The idea of a holiday makes you happy, but the holiday itself doesn't. Slightly like children. The idea of children makes people happy. Birth makes people really happy, giving birth to children. They're ecstatic that year. Actually, having teenagers later isn't associated with happiness. So sorry, I've gone all over the note about the urban. But my envisaged future is one in which, say in Ireland, the growth is in Dublin and it's densified. But the part of the point of living in Dublin is there's lots of places you can get to very near to Dublin where you can very much be on your own, and that'll be increasingly valued.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Danny. Actually, part of your answer there feeds into Richard's question on seeing the slowdown in flights. And he asks, what's the future for low cost or indeed legacy airlines?
Well, they're definitely going to try. It's interesting watching them try to come back. But, governments are only going to support one flag carrying because that's all they can support. And the cost of flying will be much higher when we return to normal, which will reduce the number of flights that we do. and for a time of fear. You know, they can put you all wearing some kind of goldfish bowl on your head in a plane, but it's not going to be a particularly enjoyable experience. And most importantly of all, more important than all of this, what were we flying for? You know, I would love to be going out for a meal with you in Dublin now after doing this. You know, it's great, but we did too much of this movement where we thought it was important. I'll never forget being in Vienna, doing a talk with some architects in Vienna. And the person who was introducing me worked at the University of Vienna, but she lived in London and she was an architect. And her friend who lived in Vienna worked as an architect at a university in London. And because both universities valued international experts, they'd both been employed to work in a university in a city in which they didn't live, but they couldn't just swap jobs. So they were commuting on planes to go and be the international expert in front of students. And just the ridiculousness of the level, the state that we got to. And if this is what it takes to drop it, it will. Of course, there'll still be some low-cost airlines. People will still need to fly between Birmingham and London and Dublin, but they won't be doing it in the way they were. And the idea of going for a stag, you know, a stag holiday in another city to which you fly, that just doesn't make any sense. Almost as little sense the idea that you'd ever want to go on a cruise ship again. Cheers, Brad.
Good to see you, Danny. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, well, look, we are getting close to time actually, so I think I'll close it there. It's been a fascinating discussion with you, Danny, and I know that our current circumstances have opened up, you know, even more relevant aspects to your book. And indeed, I've read many of your interviews in the past where you might have recommended travel actually as a very positive attribute for our graduates. Yeah. Together with humility and other things. I think, you know, we'll all have cause to reflect on how COVID has changed our thinking. And indeed your book and others like Brad's gives us an opportunity to review that. So thank you very much for your presentation. I just want to thank also our panelists, Larry O'Connell and Marie Moran and Bradley Garrett, and also the UCD Earth Institute organisers. This event is part of the UCD Plotting the Future Towards Sustainability public lecture series, which is held in collaboration with the UCD Geary Institute for Public Policy, UCD Humanities Institute, and the UCD Institute for Discovery. So this series will be back in the autumn, and you can find out more details on future.ucd.ie. And again, thank you everybody. We've had a tremendous number of participants on screen today. It's been fantastic to see it. And yes, it is a shame that you're not here in person. I'm sure there would have been a wealth of discussion, possibly over a Guinness or two, but we'll all reflect on the sense of that in the future. So thank you very much, Danny. Thank you again, panelists.
Thank you ever so much. Bye-bye.